All right, I think we're live. What's up, Giants fans, Hub watchers, NFL fans, and possibly Seahawks fans, Twitter followers, Instagram followers. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Fantastic Giants. I got with me my co-host Dan from Five Wide Football, one of the fantasy football experts, and our special guest, Edwin. I might butcher your last name. Please correct me if I butcher
Give it a try.
What were you saying?
I said, give it a try. Let's hear it.
Edwin Porras.
Dude, you got it, man. You nailed it.
Nice. All right. So we got Edwin Porras on the stream right here. He is a doctor of physical therapy and medical analyst that also writes articles for fantasypoints.com. You guys should go check it out. I have his Twitter down in the description below, and he also started a podcast recently. So before I even get into it a little bit more, Edwin, why don't you kind of introduce yourself to the audience, and why should they go out here and look at you, man?
You know, I think you should go out and give me a chance. If I'm not your flavor of medical analyst, then that's okay. I think outside the box. Not that other analysts don't necessarily, but I like to challenge convention. I like to challenge traditional thinking. I'm pretty irreverent when it comes to sports. Like, I don't care about your traditions, and I don't care about what you think. You know, sports hold a very, very special place in a lot of people's hearts. I don't want to take away from that. You know, you have a special memory with a family member at sporting events. Those aren't the things I'm talking about. I'm talking about, like, we are known for being, you know, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and we don't put up with, you know, X, Y, and Z. Like, I don't care. Like, let's talk about the facts. Let's talk about the numbers. Let's apply as much logical data as we can to help you win fantasy championships and help you be a fan, right? Like, I think one of the most annoying things is passionate fan groups who are just delusional. Those are the least favorite people.
Eagles fans, call.
I can't say anything about a specific fan group, but I think they're the ones that are the most frustrated to deal with when you present numbers, you know, hard facts, and they are not fans of it. But you should check me out because at FBInjuryDoc on Twitter, because I think that I might present a fresh take, hopefully a fresh take that you haven't heard before.
And I find that very funny that you said that about, like, fan base, because my big hint to anybody starting fantasy football is not to draft a player on your favorite team early, or maybe even at all, but definitely not in, like, those first couple of rounds. Because lots of times people are like, oh, okay, you know, he's my guy, I like him, and they go and they reach for, like, I'm pretty high on Daniel Jones right now, but, like, as a Giants fan, I have to keep tempering that going into, you know, drafts and make sure I don't go and take him too high.
I hear exactly where you come from, Five Wide. And shout out to Edward Chan in the chat, along with Jawad. Clocks was in here earlier, and Nikki also. Welcome in, guys. Share the stream. Get all your questions in later on in the stream. We will be taking questions from the fans. And so you want to just hop right into it, Dan? Before we actually started, you asked a very interesting question, or actually posed something, kind of an interesting topic to Edwin here, about the injury prone and the usage of the word injury prone. You guys want to get into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So if you follow Edwin on the FBInjuryDoc, he's got great stuff on his Twitter all the time, but he always talks about how injury prone isn't real. And so I was asking him, like, what do you mean by that? And he gave a very great detailed answer. If you could repeat it for our audience.
Yeah. So the anomaly in football and the NFL, bottom line, is that being healthy is the anomaly. There was a study conducted from 2012 to 2014. Among other things, they broke down injuries like by position, injuries by draft capital, stuff like that. So essentially what they found was they found a lot of things, but the primary finding was that only 2.3% of injuries of NFL games are actually injury-free, documented as injury-free. And you know that's a lot lower because the dudes who don't report injuries are probably suffering. You know, they either maybe feel a little woozy after the game, or they jammed a finger, they dislocate their finger, put it back themselves. So you know that number's a lot lower than it actually is documented to be. So what I'm trying to say with that is when you view NFL football players, to say like a player's injury prone is ridiculous, because most players are injured when they play the game. And I'd like to use the example of, maybe it's not the best example, but when we get in a car, right, and we drive 80, 85 miles down the interstate, 85 miles an hour down the interstate, and we get in an accident, right? If I were to get in an accident, nobody in the right, and I hurt myself, nobody in the right mind would say to me, oh man, you're got in a car accident. You're injury prone, dude. I can't believe you broke your leg or something, right? Like that's ridiculous. But for whatever reason, when these NFL football players are going on the field, putting on helmets and shoulder pads, all of a sudden when they get injured, even though it's a collision sport, we call them injury prone. Like that's just what drives me nuts. And so when I say injury prone is a lie, I'm not saying that some players aren't at a higher, increased chance of getting injured for specific types of injuries. But what I am saying is if you think that a dislocated shoulder and an ankle sprain are related, and you're using that to say that a player is injury prone, then I don't think you're seeing the full picture. I think you're being a little intellectually dishonest with yourself. And that's sort of what I mean when I say that injury prone is a lie. Not every injury is created equal, and not all of them are correlated.
I definitely hear what you're saying, because I think I made a similar point on one of my I want to say latest, I feel like the word's slipping me, but one of my more recent podcasts and video, I was talking about Eli actually, and how, one of the things Eli was known for during his career was that starting streak and not really missing a game for an injury. And one of the arguments I always made was I kind of respected him more for that, because I know there's no way he went through playing his entire career without being hurt at least once. Like, I don't know if you guys know, I know Dan knows, I'm not sure if you do, Edwin, about the 49ers NFC Championship game in 2011. The amount of hits he took that game, you can't tell me he came out without like a dislocated rib or something. He just played through it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that actually leads to like a good follow-up for you, is as I was reading your article on like Evan Ingram, and that's what got me to invite you on, was you mentioned that he is not, as you'd say, injury prone, but certain injuries aren't created equal. And Evan Ingram has had what you would call connective tissue injuries. Can you tell us why that makes him a little bit more risky? And then like, if say like Evan Ingram is more now higher rate of re-injuring himself than somebody like a Hunter Henry or a Gronk, who might, be somebody else you'd be looking at taking in a similar position in a draft.
Yeah. So the thing about the connective tissue comment that I have in there in that at fantasypoints.com and that Evan Ingram injury profile is that he's not so much a dude that I would say, this point to connective tissue and say that's why. There are other players that you might make that argument for more so than Evan Ingram, but it is something to consider that he's had two MCL sprains that have been pretty significant. That's connective tissue. And then now he's got this foot injury that it was a Lisfranc injury where he either fractured the bone or ruptured the ligament, which is connective tissue again. Right. And the concern with him specifically is that there's a study conducted on NFL players that showed a 21% drop in production from year 1 to year 2 when players have that Lisfranc issue, that Lisfranc surgery. I'm sorry. And that's partially because they do still have some hardware. You saw that with Marquise Brown last year. He was on the injury report like 7 times. He still had hardware in his foot. But when it comes to specifically that connective tissue injury, that's somebody that more, and I wanted to include that because I think it's important to sort of acknowledge and say, hey, this could be another reason, maybe at age 25, this is starting to manifest itself into something more serious, something that we potentially don't see on the surface, that, he has, specific disorders or potentially dysfunctions that can lead to these injuries. But he's not so much, it's not like the thing that I point to. Now, a player that I do point to specifically and say, it seems like this person just has connective tissue general dysfunction is somebody like Dalvin Cook. And that's a person who I would be a little more worried about specifically when it comes to that kind of issue, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's great to point out Dalvin Cook, because there's always that big back and forth on whether or not he's like a top 5 fantasy running back. And that's both in redraft and dynasty. So then I guess kind of what you're saying is, so that Lisfranc injury, people recover from it, but they're not 100% for like that first year. So does that mean that like if you have Ingram in dynasty, you don't have to worry, you can hold them for a little while, but you maybe want to avoid them in a redraft?
And
yes,
my bad. I just wanted to put an additional follow-up to that. What would be the recommended, the actual amount of time these guys should stay out versus what they do stay out in terms of recovery?
Yeah. So to answer that first question, what to do with Evan Ingram, I think that what you can do with Evan Ingram is if you're in dynasty, yeah, I definitely think he's a hold. I think that he's so damn talented that it's really difficult to not, hold on to him, especially if you have backup, if you have somebody else that you can sub in. Maybe you got lucky and have Mark Andrews on your team too. Maybe you have, Travis Kelce for whatever reason. I don't know. Maybe you have, depth at that position and you can hold on to him for dynasty. But yeah, in redraft, if you're taking him in a standard 12-team league, if you're taking Evan Ingram in like the 6th round, like the 5th or 6th round, you might be doing yourself a little bit of a disservice. Now, the flip side is he's so damn athletic that it's really difficult to say like, okay, well, let's say he does have a 21% drop off in production, right? That would mean that, let's see, Evan Ingram, 2019 points per game. That would mean that he goes, even if he has if he averaged like 15 and he drops 20%, I don't do math well. What is that? Like somebody do the math for me. So it's
3.
What's that?
3 points.
There you go. So you drop off in 3 points, right? Like that worst case scenario. Now, what you worry about specifically though is the consistency. And so is how consistent is he, and what is the ankle and the hardware doing? Is it bothering him week to week like it looks like it did for Marquise Brown? Is he having a hard time with swelling after games? Like, is he having a hard time even getting through games? All those things that you sort of think about when it comes to dealing with a Lisfranc injury. So yeah, and you're looking here at last year in PPR, he averaged, let's see, Evan Ingram averaged 13.7 PPR points. And if you're saying, what is that? Like that's a top tight end considering the landscape's so bad. But if you have a 20% drop off, like you were saying, that's 2.74 points. You probably still take that, right? But let's even round down to like a 10-point tight end. Do you really want to take a tight end in the 4th round or 3rd or 4th round, knowing that, they're going to only score 10 points in terms of a ceiling? So that's my concern with Evan Ingram, is not so much drafting him, but drafting him too early. And in terms of when players should come back from these types of injuries, it's really difficult to say, right? Because it's not that he's not ready to play at an elite level. It's that the foot itself is healed. It's just his body learning how to play under those circumstances, and a lot of times still having the hardware in the foot. That's really what you worry about, because with these Lisfranc injuries, you don't really worry about re-injury. You don't worry about refracture or re-tearing a ligament. What you're just concerned about is consistency and performance. And even though you could get an Evan Ingram that's completely healthy, the consistency because of that surgery is not as solid as you'd want it to be.
And that's a pretty good point that you bring up there. And I'm also sure that because it's different for player to player, that takes into effect as well. Kind of another follow-up to that, you were talking about how coming off that injury, production might drop. One thing I'm seeing here, I'm just looking at Pro Football Focus right now with the amount of games Ingram has played. He played 15 in 2017, 11 in 2018, 8 in 2019. This might be a very difficult thing to predict because there's so many variables in it. But in terms of the amount of time we'll see him on the field next year, do you think it would stay around the 8 games that we saw last year? Is it going to improve? Is it going to decrease? Or is it just too many variables to talk about right now?
Yeah, and that's when you move into, and I talk about it in that fantasy points piece that I have. So you move away from, even if you isolate the Lisfranc from the rest of his situation, he's had 2 concussions already, and he's in his 3rd year as an NFL player. So anytime you have those 2 concussions, like you see players like Devontae Adams, DeAndre Hopkins, a couple others that have gotten away with that. They've gotten away with having a concussion history, and then the concussions sort of just disappear. I'll put quotations around that. They just stop having concussions. But you can get away with that. But to say he'll play 8 games, 10 games, 12 games, purely from like the concussion standpoint, I'd say that he'll play more games than he did last year. And purely from like the Lisfranc injury, I think that he will play more games than he did last year. But at the same time, it's that consistency. It's that week to week volatility of, if he does play, how effective is he going to be? Because 16 games of a ceiling of 20 and a floor of 7, that's not the type of fantasy player I necessarily want to draft. And that's how I view Evan Ingram.
And just to I was doing some quick math as he was talking. So last year, if Evan Ingram played all 16 games, he would have been the tight end number 5 in PPR on his points per game. So if you put him at 11 points per game, so even with that drop off of 2 points, granted, you don't know if he's going to play, he'd still be looking somewhere at like the 7th or 8th tight end.
Right, right. Which is super important to look at, which is why I have such a hard time suggesting or recommending away from a tight end, is because of how just desolate that landscape is. So it's just hard to say you shouldn't take this person because of X, Y, and Z. So it's really, especially more so with tight ends, it's a matter of, okay, when should you take this tight end with a higher ceiling? And with Evan Ingram, I took him in Scott Fishbowl and it was way too early. I think I took him at 5'11", and that was way too early. There was a run on tight ends. I panicked and I went against my own advice. So don't be like me. Have a better draft strategy than I did.
Congrats on getting into a Scott Fishbowl, by the way.
Oh yeah, I appreciate that, guys. I know a lot of people. Did either of you guys get in it?
I did not.
You know, God,
I'm very much a casual fantasy football guy.
Oh yeah, okay, that's fine.
Yeah,
that's totally fair.
And I guess just because this was kind of an interesting one, I didn't want it to get scrolled up a little bit too much, Dan. I'm just gonna throw in a subscriber question right here, if that's fine with you, from Mike Nixon. And I'm kind of gonna show it here on the screen. He says, "Do you think we'll have a season?" I'm gonna kind of tweak that a little bit in terms of what we're talking about here with injuries and whatnot, because this is something I've brought up. I don't know how well the players are being conditioned and how well physically fit they are considering the weird offseason they're in. From that standpoint, right, do you think we're going to have a season in terms of that? And do you expect maybe an increase in injuries when we start back up because of so much rust that's going to be on them? And not everybody's going to be on the physical shape that they need to be.
Right. So just to understand the question, are the players being prepared well enough to, play a season if we have a season? Is that did I understand that right?
Yeah, basically.
Okay. Yeah. So first of all, I think that unfortunately, obviously I have a vested interest in the season playing out. A lot of us do, all of us do, we want to, even just from a fan perspective, it'd be dishonest and it'd be intellectually dishonest for me to say, I think 100% there's going to be a season. I think it's more of a toss-up than we're all sort of pretending on Twitter, right? Myself included. I'm just pretending it's going to happen. I'm just closing my eyes and hoping it does. But the possibility of there being no NFL season or a shortened NFL season are a lot higher, I think, at this point than there is that there will be a full, uninterrupted season. So from that perspective, you do have to start looking at player health. You have to start looking at how are these players being prepared for the season. And the crazy part is, you would assume that, it's these rookies that might undergo the biggest changes, and these rookies might be the ones that have the hardest time. But in reality, these rookies and their workloads, they're already changing. They're already going to be at a point where they're going from a college workload to a professional workload. They're changing their diet. They're changing their strength and conditioning regimen. They're changing their entire way of life. They're uprooting themselves from where they've been the last 2 or 3 years at least. So they have all these stressors on their life. And that's the reason that non-contact injuries, you think about the Jacksonville tight end, Josh, I'm forgetting his last name. You think about even Terry McLaurin. You think about Cortland Sutton. You think about all these rookies who have, and the list goes on and on and on back to 15, 14, 13, that these rookies have these soft tissue injuries, these connective tissue injuries that are non-contact in nature. And that's because they're changes in workload that really affect them more so than the veterans. And that's all in their rookie year, right? So then you turn around, you look at the veterans who are used to a routine, who are used to a specific, time set. They're acute, which is their short-term workloads of strength and conditioning, practice, the whole deal, over their long-term, from like 4 weeks, 6 weeks to compared to 1 week, if that makes sense, sort of like 1 week to 1 day is acute to chronic. All of those patterns of what their body is used to are going to be thrown off with this, considering there's already, 2 preseason games. There's probably not even going to be a preseason, honestly. So you look at the veterans and you start to look at the older veterans, and, you might see a slight uptick in the veterans in terms of hamstring injuries, even rolling their ankles, something like that you might not think of because their workloads are thrown off. So I don't know. You would hope that the teams are using the most up-to-date evidence, the cutting-edge science, and they're preparing their athletes' bodies as best as they can. But you obviously can't guarantee that. But what I like to say is that if you know that a team uses analytics, if you look at a team that uses analytics for their for recruiting and not recruiting, I guess scouting, and in their offense and stuff like that, I think of a team like Seattle. I'm biased, but I think of those types of teams. Those are the types of teams that probably are looking at the medical data and the strength and conditioning and research, and they're trying to apply it as best as they can. You just hope that more teams are doing that than compared to maybe just a select few.
And so as I'm listening here, and I'll let the hub hop in right after. It sounds like your fears with rookies are the same as usual, but you're fearing that veterans might have similar problems to like what you see with a lot of rookies with pulled groins, pulled hamstrings, rolled ankles, not major injuries, but just kind of, which is very common in, as if you fall fantasy and stuff, a guy his rookie year missing 2 or 3 games.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. You might expect that a little bit more. And I mean, these things are so hard to predict, right? They're so hard to project. Maybe you see a downtick because we hit a statistical anomaly. Maybe some of these guys did need to back off and take the pedal, off the floor, and you see a downtick in injuries. It's just, I like to use the term volatility a lot. And that's one way that I would describe it, is that this year with injuries, especially because of the entire COVID situation, it's extremely volatile.
I'm not sure what happened there.
All right, I was muted too. We lost you for half a second, and then
Yeah.
I unmuted, then muted myself.
Yeah, okay. Thank God it's not anything serious. Where'd you guys end off on? Because I was out for that half a second.
I think in the NFL, it's a lot more volatile in terms of project. It's already difficult to project injuries and predict injuries, nearly impossible. But this entire situation with the shortened preseason and everything is going to make it even harder.
I definitely agree with you there. And I guess since you talked about rookies, I mean, we already know that even veterans come into camp, not taking care of themselves and whatnot. Like, I think we all expect maybe an uptake in the rookies from years before in terms of them not being physically prepared. You think the veterans are taking care of themselves, or is there going to be an uptake there as well?
Yeah, I think that's the part that is really difficult to know. Certainly, there are probably going to be veterans who don't take care of themselves, right? They're maybe eating fast food. Maybe they're not going through, not even like being lazy, just not necessarily keeping up with the general regimen that they usually do. That could be a possibility. You could also have dudes who are maybe stepping on the gas a little too much. That's always a possibility. Trying to find that delicate balance between working hard and working smart, doing both, is going to be key and pivotal, which is why it's so hard to say, there will be more injuries or there'll be less injuries, but there probably are definitely guys who maybe have gotten a little used to just coasting, that maybe use the quarantine to coast a little more than they should potentially.
I'm just thinking about one of the guys I used to really thought was going to be great in fantasy football, Kelvin Benjamin. I'm like, gosh, could you imagine how big he would have gotten in this quarantine?
He blew up. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking, Kelvin Benjamin, we going to see a few more of him this year?
Yeah, there's no doubt that could definitely be a possibility.
Exactly. And real quick, how much do you know about Marcus Golden, Edwin? Because the Earl 14, I don't know if that's a reference to Earl Thomas or anything, but the Earl 14 has a pretty good question with Marcus Golden. Do you know much about him, or should we get into that or not?
Marcus Golden, let's see. Well, all I see is that he's a linebacker who's currently a free agent, and I don't know. No, I got to say I don't know exactly what that person's referring to. I'm sorry.
Okay. I guess a quick overview, maybe if you can give a quick opinion. Basically, Golden, he had an ACL injury in 2017. So he was coming off the ACL in 2018. In 2016, he had over 10 sacks for the Cardinals. The Giants signed him last year on kind of a low risk, high reward deal. He came on in 2019 and had a great 10 and a half sack season. However, there's people that believe they're not sure if he's, kind of like what you said, you hate the word injury prone. There's people that they're not sure if he's still an injury risk, and if last year was kind of a fluke because he played under the same system as he did in 2016, where he also had 10 sacks. I guess kind of like you said, you probably don't have enough information to go off of, but given the offseason that there is right now, do you think Golden might end up even being signed? Because he's not on the level of somebody like Clowney, for example, that plays the same position and is still out there and is facing some more problems technically.
So if the question is, so did he play the whole season?
He played the entire season last year, yeah.
So,
yes.
So I'll give a quick follow-up. So part of the reason people are worried is because he's strained that same knee twice and tore the ACL once. So he strained it in 2015, tore it in 2017, and then strained it again in 2018. However, he played a complete season last year, and he played 11 games in 2018.
So I think that and I'd have to know what a strain means, because a lot of times a strain is so broad. It could be a million different things, but it sounds like he totally should be good to go. You obviously can't say 100%, yes, this dude is fine, but just given the little information that I have, the ACL specifically, even though it still has a chance to re-rupture, should be fine. It takes 12 to 15 months for an ACL graft to fully mature and be 100% ready, which is why the highest risk for a re-tear of an ACL comes the year after. And so now that he's a full year removed from the ACL, I can't guarantee it, but there's no reason why you were to believe specifically that the ACL specifically, is a problem. But the age is a thing as well. And if I'm reading this correctly, let's see, he's 29. That's definitely a number that you start to get a little worried about. And it's also, you have to consider that his performance is not necessarily, like, at this point he's peaked, right? And at this point, athletically, he might not contribute 10 sacks necessarily, but can he contribute and be on the field and be effective? I think as a middle of the road defender, it sounds like he can be.
Exactly. And kind of like a very, I guess, casual outlook on it. One thing I've noticed, and of course, like, as a casual here, you're very much more an expert than I am with this topic, is that one thing I noticed with ACL injuries, no matter what the sport is, it usually takes around 2 years for a full recovery. Is that kind of accurate, or is it still a player-to-player type of thing?
So for 2 years to fully recover, I wouldn't say that. I would say, like I mentioned, just that it does take the 12 to 15 or 16 months for that ACL to be fully mature. So you just have more confidence the further away from surgery you get if they don't re-tear. So even a player psychologically, right? The more reps that they get on that knee, the more plays that they play, the longer they're on the field, the more they are comfortable with being on that knee. And that's really what you look for, and what players will help them get through, if that makes sense. So time definitely helps.
Dan, you want to get to the next question? We had some other pre-prepared questions.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess, like, my next question is going to be a little bit more going back towards fantasy. So if I'm a little higher on Ingram than the other two guys, but let's just say you're statting it out, you're making your rankings, and you've got Ingram, Hunter Henry, and Gronk as a wash talent-wise. Which one of those three do you think has, like, the highest chance of re-injury?
Of re-injury, I would have to rank Gronk at the top, Ingram second, Hunter Henry next. And the only thing you worry about with Hunter Henry is that he's had the inside the knee, so the tibial plateau fracture. So your knee is basically this joint, right? It's really hard for me to do. This is the bottom part of your leg. This is your femur, the top part of your leg. So right here is where he had that fracture, and it was inside the joint. And so that's really when you start to worry about the Todd Gurley knee, the symptomatic arthritis. And he also had an ACL tear. And I don't know specifically if it was on the same side or not, but those are the things, like, in the long term, you worry about Hunter Henry in that aspect. But he's also another one that those were kind of fluky injuries, the ACL and the tibial plateau fracture. So I would say that he's last on the list of my concerns.
How do you even get in there? Surgery wise, I guess, kind of as a medical expert here, my mind is kind of blown. That's inside the joint. How do they even get in there to try and fix that, or try and in some way help the player?
It's not pretty, right? So my expertise is everything surrounding the surgery, right? I need to know about the surgery. I need to know of the surgery, the specifics of all the protocols after. But obviously the surgeons are the ones who do that. But I have spoken to plenty of surgeons. I've watched plenty of surgeries, and I'll keep it light. It's not pretty. It's a pretty gruesome procedure. There's a reason they give you pain meds after those procedures. And the way that they get in there is they're not gentle, and they can't be. So I know it's difficult to explain, but I don't want to get too gruesome on the stream.
And so is there, with a surgery like that, now I know you're saying he's the least re-injure risk, I guess. I'm trying to avoid using the P word.
It's okay, you can say it.
So is there any risk, though, with a surgery like that he could have complications from the surgery, because you're trying to get in at a weird angle, completely different off topic, but like my aunt had a brain aneurysm, and they had to have the surgery, and she was lucky, but there's always a risk when you're performing that type of surgery that they can hit something that could affect your tons of different brain function, from cognitive to memory to all that. So is there any worry with the surgery like that they could hit another tendon or some muscle or anything like that?
Yeah, well, first, I'm sorry to hear about that. I hope she's doing well or did well. However that went.
Years ago, she had no problems. But it's just
good. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So when it comes to brain surgery versus like an orthopedic, like a fracture that you're trying to pin or put back in place or whatever, like an ACL tear, the risks for things like an infection are still there. The risks of really, that's your highest thing that you're worried about. Potentially, rupturing an artery is something that you worry about, but the risk versus the reward is, generally speaking, it's pretty well balanced. You are not concerned so much with, especially with like an ACL surgery, that there's so much research and there's so much data on the specific ways to do an ACL surgery that, generally speaking, the risks for complications are really low. You can still get like nerve damage, I guess, but it's just not as common. So he has, and again, the further you get away from surgeries, the more confident you are in the player's ability to continue to push through. So when it comes to that, he's probably seen the worst of it. Of course, until, like I mentioned, potentially that he gets that symptomatic arthritic knee condition.
Another player for the Giants that's actually coming off an injury is Jabril Peppers. He's coming off of, and once again, as much as you can shine some light on this, he's coming off of a transverse process fracture in his back. That's kind of a mouthful. What can you tell us about that in terms of recovery, or is it even a serious one? I know he was put on injury reserve. He got the injury week 12 last year, I believe, and sat out the rest of the season. Well, what are we looking at here with that, if you can tell us anything?
Yeah, so the thing about the transverse, and I've looked into the transverse process fracture when that happened to him. There isn't a ton of data on it, if I remember correctly, it's one of those injuries that's like so random. So essentially, you have this. You know what? I'll grab the model. I'll do it. I told myself I wouldn't do this.
Thank you for that, by the way.
All right. So transverse process, and I think it was in his neck, right?
Yeah.
So a transverse process is this like little. Let's see. I'll put it in front of this one. This part of the vertebrae, right? So like it was in his neck. So like this is a transverse process. This is a transverse process. So that little part of the bone is fractured, and it can get dangerous because if it fragments, then you can dislocate the vertebrae. A lot of things can happen, and it's just extremely painful too, obviously. But I think that if it's healed, and it's such a rare injury, again, if he's healed fine, there's always a chance that it refractures. But the problem with those types of fractures is that you can't do anything about it. You just have to immobilize. You don't move. You let time do its thing. But from like a long-term perspective, if that's healed and if he's ready to come back, then he shouldn't have any further issues with it. Sorry, guys, I didn't prep for these questions.
No, it's all right, man. I feel kind of bad throwing it on you as well, but you did pretty good bringing out the model and everything.
It's behind me. I know it's right behind me.
Yeah, but I'm actually kind of surprised that it's like it's not as serious as I thought it was, because obviously it's connected to the spinal cord and whatnot, and generally you kind of want to avoid injuries to that part of your body. So I am kind of surprised that in terms of the healing factor, it's not as serious. I don't want to say serious, but I guess it's not as heavy as I thought it would be. If that makes sense.
And it can be, and that's why you have to be so careful with those. So I don't mean to like minimize it necessarily, because at the time when it's fractured, you do have to be extremely careful because it is so close to the spinal cord, like you said. Those are the types of procedures that you do start to worry a little bit about risks and potentially damaging nerves if you have surgeries. So what I'm trying to say is it was serious, and the further away you get from treatment and stabilizing the area and playing football, then the less dangerous it becomes. The danger sort of becomes mitigated, but it is at the time extremely serious. It's a serious condition. You have to take it seriously. It's not like you roll your ankle or you jam your thumb, even fracture your finger, and you just move on. It's something that you definitely have to take care of.
Definitely.
And then so just listen to that. It also sounds like it's something where you kind of worry a little bit about muscle atrophy, because you're saying he can't really move.
Yeah, and atrophy is a relative term, because like for an NFL athlete, like the amount of atrophy that will happen when they don't train, right, is going to be a lot more than, because they have to be in tip-top shape, right? So any amount of muscle that doesn't continue to be worked is a loss, and so that's something that he really has to do. He has to gain back and train for, and yeah, just the general immobility is obviously not ideal for an NFL player.
But I'm just going to speak to like a little bit of knowledge I had. I'm surprised at how little atrophy takes longer to occur than I think people think. So just a quick background: my daughter broke her tibia about 2 months ago. She's in a cast for 6 weeks. She's one, so we were like a little worried with her walking and stuff. Within a day, she was already pulling herself up and putting weight on it. So I think like sometimes people get, and you can speak to it probably a little bit better, people expect the atrophy to be a lot more severe than it is. Like I was worried she wasn't going to be able to put any weight on it for weeks, and she was walking the next day.
Right. And it all depends too on the specific type of injury and the protocol that the surgeon wanted or the doc wanted. But a lot, and especially kids are so resilient. Their bones are so much more plastic than our bones are. And so as long as a player specifically is following the protocols that the surgeon and the PT set forth, then sometimes they can still train. They can do opposite side work. They can do opposite hand work, stuff like that. A lot of times they can still do like cardio and stuff like that. So yeah, it's anything you can do to avoid deconditioning is basically what it is. Then that's a good thing.
And shout out to Kid Blue real quick. He just tuned in. I see Kid Blue, you missed probably the best part of the stream so far, where he broke out the model to talk about Jabril Peppers' spinal injury. And Edward Chan had a question. I'm guessing this was, since we were kind of on the topic of spinal injuries, he was talking about Ryan Shazier. Now, I have no idea what exactly Ryan Shazier had, but it was definitely a lot more severe than Jabril Peppers, but also spinal related, right?
Yeah, so he had a spinal cord injury, straight up spinal cord injury. And if I were to get that model out again, right? So what you do is when that happens is his head went backwards, and you can't really see it. I don't want to do too much here, but like the spinal cord gets pinched when you extend your head backwards. Like this is the bottom of the skull. This is flexing your head forward. This is going backwards. And essentially what happened to Shazier, he got hit, his head got snapped backwards, and it was snapped backwards enough that it encroached. The bones actually pinched the spinal cord and caused damage to his entire body, really, because the spinal cord is basically like the central, the chief center for movement. And that's what he's dealing with. So that's what happened with him.
And thank God he's making a full recovery. I know for a while, a lot of experts thought he couldn't even walk again. So
yeah, it's not uncommon for the type of injury he had. He's come a long, long way.
Yeah, it's always good to hear. That's the other thing. Like when we do a podcast like this and stuff, obviously these are people. So I like to always state that, because I know on Twitter and stuff, I hear people like ripping guys they drafted, guys on their team and stuff like that. Like these are adults making a living. So like, just kind of remember that.
100%. That's I couldn't beat that drum any harder. I'm coming from a perspective of seeing not these NFL players, not these specific guys we're talking about, but I do see patients on a daily basis that, they talk to me about their families. They talk to me, and therapists in general. I mean, they talk to us about what they're doing this weekend. They talk to us about, when their grandma passed away. They tell us everything. They tell us this is the current situation. This is, a lot of times they get into like, this is my financial situation. And it's no different for these NFL players. It's just on a different level. So it's easier for me, I think, to try to keep that into perspective. I know a lot. It's easy when you just are like on your phone, you hit draft to a player, you start them in your lineup, and then you just move on with your life. And so it's easy for people to say, oh, F you for this and that, but you have no idea what they're going through. The injury report is honestly really, it's vague, and a lot of probably more players that are not on the injury report really are injured. You have no idea what's going on with them in their personal life. So I think that's a good point by you, is that these people are humans, and we need to remember that.
Yeah, definitely. And I know I did have one more question that I sent over for you, and that was like, so from a fantasy perspective, like 3 guys that people are high on that you're kind of worried because of their injury, their injury history. Obviously, I'm going to steal the first one you're probably going to say is Dalvin Cook.
Yeah. So Dalvin Cook, right? He's the guy that unfortunately the data shows that so the best chance of him not redislocating his shoulder, because at this point we don't know that he's had surgery. It doesn't seem like he's had surgery for that shoulder that he redislocated. There's a 42% chance. So players who are in college and dislocate their shoulder, 42% of them that don't have surgery go on to redislocate in the NFL within 15 weeks. You also look at the statistics for just players in the NFL in general who dislocate their shoulder and don't have surgery, come back within 2 to 3 weeks, and they redislocate their shoulder 55% of the time. So you're looking at these 2 studies that don't bode well for Dalvin Cook because he hasn't had surgery. And there's a 42% chance on, best case scenario, there's a 42% chance he re-injures, redislocates, 55% chance, worst case scenario. So that's what you're looking at with Dalvin Cook. And so he is, I don't want to say he's the easiest player to analyze, but I do want to say there's the most data available for his specific injury. And we know that this is the 4th time that he's dislocated a shoulder since high school. So he's obviously a person that has done this over and over and over again. And if he does it one more time, eventually you cannot, just as a human, you can't move forward and continue to have shoulder redislocate, because it starts to redislocate when you're laying in bed. It starts to redislocate when you try to use a rail to walk up the steps. It redislocates when you're trying to, a lot of these guys are married and have kids. When you try to pick up your kid, it'll redislocate. So these are the types of things that you need to consider when we look at Dalvin Cook. And at some point, even if he does come back in the 2 to 3 weeks again, like he did last year, surgery, if he continues to redislocate, is a very, very, very viable possibility.
And anybody who knows any wrestlers, I've heard of that. I mean, I knew guys in college that were very good wrestlers that never wrestled again. They had to, they just had to stop doing it after 2 or 3 dislocations, dislocating their shoulder 2 or 3 times, because you get a guy up on top of you. So I'm sure it's the same thing for football.
Oh, yeah, me too. When I was on my high school wrestling team, one of my friends, he dislocated his shoulder, and he didn't even take a chance after the first time. Well, obviously, it's because, high school, much younger, you kind of don't want to get too injured when you're a teenager and whatnot, but he knew the risks, and he didn't even take a chance after the first shoulder injury.
And that's the thing, too, about that specific injury, is that a lot of dudes and gals will just live with it. They just live with it. They'll put it back in themselves. A lot of I don't like to insert anecdotes. I like to be as objective as possible, but I mean, that happened to me. I dislocated my shoulder. I dislocated my shoulder as a high school football player. And until I was 20 years old, it continued to dislocate when I played basketball. Anytime I try to deflect a pass up here, it would dislocate. So what would I do? I would just put it in myself, and then I'd keep playing. So it's probably not the most
to hurt though.
So it hurts. It definitely hurts, and it like sets off all these alarms in your head. That's like, okay, my arm should not be in this position. But yeah, it's one of those things that you really have to take care of. I eventually took care of it myself. So I know it's an injury that does not go away by itself.
And kind of 2 different comments, but in a way related. We have one from Edward Chan saying, would Dalvin Cook eventually have to quit? And then from Kid Blue saying that he's a walking injury, he might not finish a season in his career. So in terms of career outlook, do you think he will ever finish a season in his career? Or do you think that the shoulder injury and dislocating, like you said, it gets to a point where you're laying down and it dislocates? Do you think he'll eventually just have to walk away because of that?
You hope not, right? I mean, you really, you hope not. But it can turn into that. it can turn into it coming out in bed. It can turn into him not being able to finish a game. It can turn into that. He's obviously shown a propensity for it to dislocate and then redislocate. So, he's had the surgeries before. The right shoulder didn't dislocate. So you hope that the same thing can be said. But, the fact that he didn't have surgery is, I don't blame the guy, right? Because you don't want to go through a 9-month surgery with that type of rehab process, over and over again. So I can't necessarily say I blame him for not getting the surgery, but you look to him and you're sort of like, man, I wish that you would have gotten the surgery. So I can't say that he won't finish, he won't finish the season, but I hope he does. And maybe he's in the statistical minority, right? Because statistics are statistics, there's nothing's 100% in any direction. Maybe he falls into the, the 45% that doesn't redislocate or whatever, the 58% who don't redislocate. So that's what you sort of hope for with him.
And I always think of another Vikings running back, like Adrian Peterson was injury prone early on in his career. People used to say, because he had the bad ankles and he tore his ACL, yet he's still playing 15 years later,
Yeah, right. So, and I definitely understand that. I would also say that Adrian Peterson is a freak of nature, like unlike any other person.
I'm kind of glad you brought up the freak of nature part, because one of my follow-up questions after Dan brought up Adrian Peterson was Saquon, and I was like, because Saquon had his very first injury of his entire football career last year with the high ankle sprain, and I just kind of want to get your outlook on that. But you could finish the freak of nature Adrian Peterson point too. We got a freak of nature and Saquon over here. Let me get my camera back in focus.
So it's funny that Adrian. Dan, I totally understand what you're saying, and yes, you're like that type of narrative of a player being injury prone and having injuries and blah blah blah. But then they're still playing years later. I mean, look at Aaron Rodgers. He's the same dude. Carson Wentz is on the same trajectory. He was hurt a lot, but he's probably going to be fine the rest of his career if the statistics play out the way that they should. A lot of different players have these injury sort of narratives created about them, and they're not right. But Adrian Peterson is even an exception, unto himself. He came back at I think it was 7 or 8 months after an ACL, but he is like the cream of the crop athlete. He's a dude that is even among NFL elites. He is like the top 1% elite from an athletic perspective. And so you see it now. He's 35 years old. And he's playing like, an aging 28-year-old running back, which obviously they don't get a lot of volume and they don't do great, but he's 35 years old. He's almost 10 years. I mean, he's 10 years. He's 35, right? So Ezekiel Elliott is 24. He's 11 years older than Ezekiel Elliott. He's been playing in the league, like 25% of Ezekiel Elliott's life. He's been in the league, yeah. Adrian Peterson. So that's what I think of when I think of AP. And then Saquon's injury actually isn't the first time he's had that. That was the third ankle sprain that he's had. So I am starting to look at him a little sideways.
I won't say that. I don't know, for some reason, I don't know why, but for some reason in my mind, was it like the first major injury he had?
It was his first NFL injury. So it was his first major NFL injury. And then when he only missed, I think, 2 games in college because of ankle injuries, but that's really been the extent of it. But I am a little bit curious. I won't say that he, is prone to these ankle injuries per se, but I am looking, and if I'm splitting hairs, right? Like if I'm splitting hairs between CMC and Barkley, which, you're already splitting hairs, you're probably going to go CMC anyway, just because of the situation as a whole. But if you really wanted a reason to pick between one or the other, I would go Christian McCaffrey because of that injury with ankle issues. But I mean, it's, again, you're splitting hairs. I'm not necessarily saying it's like a huge issue.
Yeah, I can definitely see that as well. Sterling Shepard with concussions, right? You're nodding your head, so I'm assuming you have a little bit of insight on that. With Shepard, he had 2 concussions. Dan, do you remember in how many weeks? I think it was in 2 weeks or in 3 weeks, something crazy like that. And it got to a point where the dude was considering retirement and whatnot.
I feel like he's Wes Welker come again. Like, he's just, I hope not, knock on wood, but I feel like he might be forced to retire because of that. But let's see what the doctor.
Yeah. So the thing about Sterling Shepard is you did see a moment where, I think what happened was the NFL basically botched the concussion protocol. They missed spotting the first concussion that happened. He played through it, and then you saw him get another one. Now, the thing about Sterling Shepard is this is like his 5th or 6th since high school. So he's had several of these, and he's actually been on the injury report with a cervical strain, which is just as bad because that probably means at some point his head got snapped around, right? Which is not good for your brain either. And so he's had all of these concussions. He is, when you think of Brandon Cooks, when you think of somebody like Jordan Reed, when you think of these players who have had this massive list of concussions, you have to think of Sterling Shepard. And that goes, sort of under the radar, I think. But I think that he's definitely a player that, and you saw, he took the extra time to visit with his family. That's what the reports were, is that he took the time to spend with his family, discuss, which direction do I want to take here? What's best for my family? And he decided to come back. But those are the things you can't ignore. And that it goes back to the conversation about these people being humans, right? Like, he loves football. He's only ever known football. He probably identifies with football in some major way. And so it sucks to say, but he could be, the game could be taken from him, in just one more play on an NFL field.
Yeah, and that's it's sad to say, but that's the truth when you're playing a contact sport like football at the speeds that they play.
Yeah, you got guys the size of refrigerators running at each other at the speed of cheetahs. There's bound to be. I just, when you brought up the fact that he visited his family and whatnot, like, just as, not even as a fan, just as a fellow human being, when I read those reports, I felt so bad for him. I legitimately, it's like you said, the guy probably only knows football. He's having one of the things that means the most to him in his life probably taken away. But when you're talking about a situation of my passion and my life, you're probably going to choose your life, to spend it with your family and whatnot. It really is something that could end up, just slipping through his fingers.
100%.
And so I did want to just one more guy besides Dalvin Cook that you're avoiding for injuries, though, for fantasy, real quick.
Oh man, avoiding. So that's a tough one because I try not to avoid a lot of players because of injuries, because a lot of times, again, it's a matter of, is it truly something that's going on because of injuries? So I guess a cop-out would be, since I already mentioned Brandon Cooks is a guy that at any point, I think, and the reason I want to hammer that home is because Brandon Cooks is a guy who, for whatever reason, people are ignoring the concussion history. And I don't want to hammer it. I don't want to act like it's the end of the world. I don't want to act like other players haven't played through concussions before. But he's had 5 since 2017, I think. And that's a lot of concussions. And that's one concussion away from just being done with the NFL. That's one concussion away from being, again, stripped of the game in general. And so when I see these people who are taking, Brandon Cooks early in drafts, who are touting, take Brandon Cooks as your first wide receiver off the board, which is fine, whatever, from a fantasy perspective, if that's what you think. But I think they're ignoring the floor, and the floor is literally one concussion, miss 5 games, one concussion, miss 10 games, one concussion, be out for the season. And that's the reality of the floor with Brandon Cooks.
And I just pulled up, he's had 4 concussions since 2018. Granted, one of them was the Super Bowl. So it was like February of 2018, but that's still a lot of concussions to have in your life.
Yes.
Yeah,
And the thing about concussions too, and I know that we can only compare it in relative terms. Like, you can only compare an NFL concussion to an NFL concussion, but the American Academy of Neurology, which is just a general branch of medicine, they don't even recommend a player come back to play or do their sport until 4 weeks. If they lose consciousness, the AMA doesn't recommend, or ANA, sorry, American Academy of Neurology, whatever, AAN, they don't recommend a player coming back or doing your sport again until 4 weeks if they lose consciousness. And how many times do we see a player literally look like they lose consciousness on the field, right? They get into that decorticate or decerebrate position where they're extended or flexed, right? And they don't look like they're moving. And then they're back the next week, or they're back the next play, right? The NFL And we love the NFL, and I hate, I feel like I'm hammering it constantly. I act like I don't love the NFL and benefit from the NFL and enjoy fantasy football and things like that. I'm a fan of the NFL, but the reality is the reality, and they just play by a separate set of rules.
Yeah,
exactly. And they do always try, like, it's almost every year you see like a review to the concussion protocol, or you see them reviewing how the helmets are made, which there's even a debate about that, like, because concussions happen with the brain contact with your skull, and not, so it's like, how much can you actually prevent that with something that's on the outside? There's a whole debate about that and whatnot. But the NFL, it's like you said, the same thing here. I don't want to act as if I don't love them, but they're definitely not perfect when it comes to concussions right here.
And like you also said and talk about too, is that these people are freak athletes as well. Like, these people are really, like, they're not your average guy walking down the street. They're very tough. They're very good athletes. They've trained very hard for this. So they can probably hide a mild concussion a little bit more than, say, I could, or somebody who's not working out and taking those hits every day. And that,
which is an interesting point, Dan. I'm going to interrupt you because you are spot on 100%. And you know what's really sad is that and I say sad because I mean sad. There's a study conducted from 2012 to 2015 on concussions, and they actually showed that younger players were more likely to be diagnosed with concussions. Why do you think that is? Because as they go on, the veterans say, hey, this is how you pass the test. Hey, do it this way. Hey, don't say this. Hey, do that. It's unfortunate, but it's in the undertones of everything that has to do with playing in the NFL and being an experienced player. So you're exactly right. And the data shows the older that you get, the less likely you are to have a concussion.
Yeah. Even though probably statistically you think about, like, constantly being hit, it raises your chance of getting a concussion. So, like, I'm going to throw in an antidote again, but I played football in high school, and I never got a concussion. Then my first week in college, I'm playing basketball. Some guy hits me as I'm going up for a layup. I fell awkwardly on my head, and I straight up was so confused. I tried walking into a woman's bathroom. It took me probably 20 minutes to figure out, like, exactly everything that was, like, going on. And it was just funny because it wasn't even that hard of a hit. And when I looked it up, it's like, because I had taken hits through the years, it just kind of raises your chance of getting a concussion.
Yeah, exactly. Micro traumas are not to be ignored. They're just as important to consider.
And since we're gonna end off probably around 5 minutes or so, one other question that Dan and I spoke about beforehand was kind of leaving the Giants for a second, heading general NFL. Can you give us your thoughts on Cam? And Cam going into this year, of course, he's kind of had a good amount of injuries on his body and whatnot. And how do you think he's going to perform? Do you think he's fully recovered? Obviously, that was a major talking point amongst teams and media and whatnot before he signed with the Patriots.
So I think Cam is healthy. I think he's getting healthy if he's not healthy yet. So the average return to sport for a Lisfranc injury is 8 to 10 months, or 8 to 12 months, sorry. And that's what the data shows, right? Generally speaking, dudes can start doing high-level performance stuff at 6 to 9 months. And Cam had surgery in December. We're sitting here almost in August. So he would, theoretically speaking, be ready to go by next month, sorry. And I think that he's there. I think that the reason that the Lisfranc issue is a problem with skill players is because they're planting, they're cutting, they're running routes, they're stopping, they're blocking. They're doing a lot more than what a quarterback necessarily would do. And so when it comes to that Lisfranc injury, I think that he can still be successful, especially in that offense with Bill Belichick. That they'll build around him is what I'm trying to say. And since re-injury isn't necessarily a concern with the Lisfranc injuries, I think that he can be fine. The shoulder, the last time that they checked, they did an arthroscopic procedure and they looked inside and it didn't look damaged. It looked fine. He didn't report any symptoms. And so the shoulder's doing fine. I think that a lot of people are sleeping on Cam Newton. And if he's not ready, like I said, by week 1, if we end up having the season, I think that he's going to be really, really close. And I think that within the first month of the season, we might see him start come to form.
Any last thoughts on that, Dan?
I was going to say, people forget to form for Cam Newton as MVP. I mean, he was an MVP, and in 2018, before he started getting injured and playing.
Bless you.
Sorry, everybody. I should have hit the mute before he started having those injuries.
He was playing at an MVP level.
He was. I think that he was. If I remember correctly, he was either QB2 behind Patrick Mahomes.
No, he was QB2. It wasn't either. The only person ahead of him at that time in the MVP race was Patrick Mahomes. And that was after Cam changed his throwing motion and everything to adapt to the shoulder surgery that he had that offseason. I think it was the 2018 offseason. Yep. So it's like after all the doubters and everything, and he was still playing up to form.
Yep, 100%.
So people forget that. I agree. A lot of people are sleeping on Cam. If he could even come back to being 70-80% of what he was at his peak, that's still a top 10, maybe top 5 quarterback.
Yeah,
at his peak,
top 10,
he was 1 or 2. He was, he was right up there. But that's really all I got.
Yeah. So thank you guys all for tuning in. Thank you so much to Edwin, the FBInjuryDoc on Twitter. Make sure you go follow him there. Make sure you check out his articles on fantasypoints.com and check out his podcast, which is ironically called Injury Prone.
Injury Prone Fantasy Football Podcast, man. Check it out. Subscribe. Listen, please.
Exactly. Go over to 5 Wide, my co-host. Sub him up. Any last thoughts from Edwin? Any last thoughts from Dan before we sign off?
Well, I just wanted to thank Edwin again for coming on. This was really fun.
Thanks again, guys. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Oh, jeez. I'm sorry. My dog is shedding like crazy, and it's affected my allergies. I vacuumed the other day, so I thought I'd be good. But
it's funny. Around the time I said we're gonna end off, I heard the dog come in actually, and I was like, perfect time.
My dog is interrupts every one of our streams by going crazy. But like I said, I have a young daughter, so I can't put him upstairs because he's just too big, runs around too much.
Yeah, you can't trust him. You can't trust him.
Yeah. So
that's what my wife says about me. Don't worry.
My wife says that about me too. But
thanks, guys. Again, I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. This was really fun.
For sure. I actually learned a lot too. So once again, go over all their information is down in the description below, guys. Click it, follow, sub. Thank you for tuning in, and we're out.